Dr. Amen, it is such an honor to introduce you to you and your work to Estonian readers. Welcome.
Chris, thank you so much. It's a joy to be with you.
But allow me to start by getting to know you as a person first, Dr. Amen, and then we'll go and talk about your book, Memory Rescue, the reason that we are talking today. You are a psychiatrist, a brain disorder specialist, a founder of Amen clinics. You have 9 clinics all over the American country, and you are also a best-selling author. And you have been writing books since 1995, if I'm not mistaken, and more continuously and consistently starting from 2000, and sometimes even a couple of books per year. That must need lots of inspiration and motivation. Where does your inspiration come from?
You know, mostly the patients we see. When we first started doing our brain imaging work, it was so fascinating. And the stories just sort of keep on coming. And I love telling stories and I love helping people. So writing sort of worked for me. And but the brain is involved in everything you do, all aspects of life. So whether it's your memory or your mood or your focus or your relationships. And so there are just so many stories to tell.
You obviously love writing, as I see, and it's not very common amongst doctors to be a best-selling author also. What is it in writing that you love the most? Is there anything specific?
So my first book I actually wrote in 1982.
Oh, wow.
I graduated from medical school. And it was so much fun. I would just crack myself up or make myself laugh. And I loved the process. And then I started writing articles. And in 1986, I wrote a course called The Sabotage Factor. And I like taking what I learn and sharing it, because I've come to believe you don't really keep something until you give it away. And I did a big book called The Daniel Plan with Pastor Rick Warren that went international. And it was this program to get the world healthy through churches. And it was just so clear to me that when people did it together, they actually doubled their weight loss. And there's a prayer I like, the prayer of St. Francis. And in it, he talks about, for it is in the giving that we receive. And my children, my daughter just went off to college and we had sort of the Last Supper last week. And they gave me the best compliment I've gotten in a long time. They just said, it's sort of irritating, Dad. You're the most consistently happy person we know. And I think it comes from teaching other people how to have better brains and better lives, because then I live it. Because if you don't live the message, you cannot give it. Right. So being authentic is important. So it's a long answer, but those were the thoughts that jumped into my head.
But besides like ordinary books, you have also written a cookbook.
Well, you know, if you read my work, and including Memory Rescue, there's a lot of food stuff.
Yes, there is.
I think our American lousy diet, I call it SAD, the standard American diet, is responsible for a lot of mental health, brain health problems. And so the Brain Warriors Way cookbook, mostly it was written by my wife. It's just a statement that there's no suffering in getting well. that you can eat in an amazing, delicious way. You just have to use the big brain God gave you.
Yeah, that's really that's very fascinating. I love the Brain Warriors cookbook, by the way. It gives lots of good ideas, and you do have very many recipes all around your books. But who's the real cook in your house? Is it your wife, Tara?
So Tana, when I met her, she couldn't cook. In fact, I prayed she wouldn't cook because she was such a disaster. But the more she learned about my work and about nutrition in general, she's a nurse by training, the more she just loved being in the kitchen, making us healthy things. And so I think it was 11 years ago, 12 years ago, when I wrote Change Your Brain, Change Your Body, I said, hey, would you write a cookbook to go along with it? And she loved the process.
But who's cooking in your house?
We share it. I think it's sort of a combination of both of us.
Do you sometimes use your own cookbooks also, or is it very like creative process when you cook together?
I tend to be more routine. So I have things I really like. And my personality is I just sort of find comfort in doing similar things. I almost always have a shake in the morning after I've fasted for probably 14 hours is what I generally do. And then a salad with some protein for lunch, and dinner varies. My favorite recipe is her lamb chop recipe. It's just better than anything I've ever had anywhere else.
So we were talking about Tana, and it is said that behind every great man, there is a great woman. And apparently you have found your great woman. For me, from very far distance, it seems that you and Tana, you work as one solid unit. What kind of a role does she keep and play in your tandem?
I think about 60% of the people who follow us are females. And so she really has this very strong female voice that is important to hear. I don't know if you know about the ACE score. It's Adverse Childhood Experience score. And out of these 10 bad things that can happen to children, how many do you have? Well, she has 8. I have 1. And she really brings a different perspective. So I'm more of the doctor, the clinical person, the helper. And she often can speak from real life, chronic stressful experiences. She has a new book called The Relentless Courage of a Scared Child, which I'm so proud of her for telling her story, because I just think it helps other people. So she's very important to, I adore her, and thank God we get along. So I often say, how many of you have been in a bad relationship when I lecture? And, it's like 2/3 of the audience raises their hand. And I'm just not doing that anymore. So I'm grateful I have a good relationship with her. And, I use that line to actually talk about food. It's like, okay, how many of you are in a bad relationship with food? How many of you love food that abuses you, that hurts you, that kills you early? But thank you for asking about Tana.
How is she today, by the way?
Well, she's actually on her way to Dallas. My daughter's going to college, and they're doing a college trip to get her there. So I know she's excited for Chloe and sad for her.
Yeah, and I bet that your pets are also sad to see one of the parts of the family going away. From your books, it shows that pets also play very significant role in your life.
They do. We have this beautiful white shepherd and
yes.
Balinese cat that is devious but very sweet.
So in Memory Rescue, the book that we are talking about, you have told us about how you found the SPECT scanning and why you fell in love with it. But how did you manage to find your passion towards food and especially nutrition? It's also amongst psychiatrists, it's not so common.
It's not, and it should be.
Yeah.
And I found it by listening to my patients. And it happened early on when I had, because I'm also a child psychiatrist, and I had an autistic patient. And the mother said when she took him off of gluten and dairy, he got 50 words the next week. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh, I should pay attention to that. And then when I started looking at the brain, I realized many of the medications we prescribed were actually not that good for the brain. And I started thinking about natural ways to heal the brain. And food's the first thing. And there's a lot of research showing that food can enhance mood. And food can actually trigger anxiety. I did a podcast last week, and the host said he was feeling way more anxious than usual. And he's like, what am I doing differently? And he was eating more roasted pecans. Mm-hmm. And when he got the pecans out of his diet, his anxiety went away. And so I think one of the reasons I've been successful as a psychiatrist is I'm really good at listening to my patients and then integrating what they tell me with what I know. And elimination diets, basically where you eliminate all the bad things, have been found to be a treatment for ADD. There's actually 2 studies from Holland and show when you put kids on elimination diets, 70% of them don't have ADD symptoms anymore. So it's not a medication deficiency. It could be we're not nourishing the brain as we could.
So, and you can see also the results of the changes in your diet, in your SPECT scans. Is that correct?
Well, over time, in fact, I just published a new study on 35,000 scans that showed as your weight goes up, the physical size and function of your brain goes down. And that should just scare the fat off anyone. And given here in the United States, I mean, I'd be interested in Estonia, what's the obesity problem? But it's a big, no pun intended, problem here. Mm-hmm. And 72% of Americans are overweight, 42% are obese. The pandemic made it worse. Mm-hmm. And fat on your body does so many bad things. So, you know, the big idea in Memory Rescue is if you want to keep your brain healthy or rescue it, if it's headed for trouble, you have to prevent or treat the 11 major risk factors that steal your mind. Well, if you're overweight, you now have 6 of the 11 risk factors. And it's like, oh, mm-hmm. It's, and who knew? I'm a psychiatrist. You know, why do I care? Because I want you to have a better brain. And if you do anything to harm your brain, you're harming your memory, your mood, your money, because you won't make good decisions, and your relationships.
So basically everything, and I totally agree with that, everything starts and ends with the health of your brain, and everything good that you do for your brain, you do for your whole body. And vice versa also, everything bad that you do for the whole body.
Absolutely. And the brain is an organ, like your heart is an organ. And I've been blessed to see some stars in my life. And one of them is Justin Bieber. And I'm in his new docuseries, Seasons. And like many celebrities, he'll do what I say sometimes, maybe. But he was going through a rough patch, and he came in my office and he said, I get it. My brain is an organ, like my heart is an organ. If you told me I had heart problems, I'd do everything you said. And he started doing the things I asked him to do, and he got much better. So we have to think of it not as you're going to see a psychiatrist for your mind, but my hope is you see a psychiatrist for your brain. Because when your brain is right, your brain creates your mind. And if your brain's not right, your mind won't be right.
You said about the 11 factors, you call them a formula, bright minds. And it's like from blood flow until sleep issues and everything in between. So what do you see? What do we have the most challenges with nowadays? Has it changed?
Well, the D in bright minds, diabesity, has really changed over my lifetime. That we were not obese in the 70s, and now we are. And part of that comes from taking fat out of the diet, demonizing fat, when 60% of the solid weight of your brain is fat. And so low fat diets actually increase depression. And we know depression is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So bad food is a big contributor. Infections. That's the second I, immunity and infections. I think in 30 years, there's going to be a whole sub-branch of psychiatry on infectious disease psychiatry. The world is fighting COVID. COVID clearly affects the brain, not for everybody, but for a significant number of people. We know one of the early symptoms is you lose your sense of taste and smell. Well, those are brain functions. And I have a number of before and after SPECT scans on COVID-19 patients. I had their scan before COVID and after COVID, and it tends to activate the limbic or emotional centers of the brain. Yeah. And it increases the risk of anxiety and depression, not for everybody, but for vulnerable people, especially people who are not really thinking about their health. And so people with low vitamin D levels, people who are overweight, people who just don't care about what they put in their bodies. Those are the people that are the most vulnerable. Toxins is a big issue. The T in bright minds. People here in the United States, I don't know how it is in Europe, but we're legalizing marijuana everywhere. And I'm actually a fan of legalizing it. I don't want anybody smoking pot to go to jail. I mean, that's just a terrible use of resources. But it's not a health food, and it's not innocuous. I published a study on 1,000 marijuana users. Every area of their brain was lower in activity. And alcohol is no better. When I first started imaging, like I have no dog in the alcohol fight. But when I started imaging, I'm like, oh, if you drink, your brain looks older. And so I've not been a fan, right? I don't want to do anything that prematurely ages my brain. I just turned 67. And as you know, I go into my 70s and 80s, I want my brain to work. Right? I'm pretty concerned about that. And alcohol decreases brain function. And, but, you know, for years, for decades, really, people were like, oh, I should have my glass of red wine every night because it's good for my heart. Maybe it's bad for your brain. one of the big lessons, if you said, hey, Daniel, it's the single most important thing you've learned from 188,000 scans. Mild traumatic brain injury ruins people's lives. And nobody knows about it because no psychiatrists aren't looking at the brain. And I feel like I'm living in this time warp where most psychiatrists around the world make diagnoses, anxiety, depression, Alzheimer's disease, without ever looking at the brain. Mm-hmm. And that's insane. And, my colleagues for many years called me crazy. And I'm a psychiatrist. I'm not crazy. I don't hear voices. I'm not delusional. I have a family that loves me. No, I'm not crazy. It's crazy not to have technology. It's crazy to have technology and not use it. And to assume because someone tells you they're depressed or they tell you they have memory problems, that you actually know what's going on physiologically. It's sort of ridiculous. And I feel like this time warp where I've been fighting my colleagues for decades. And just recently, thank God, the Canadian Association of Nuclear Medicine, a prestigious scientific body in Canada, wrote new procedure guidelines for SPECT, basically as if I wrote them. So I feel like that was a big battle that we won.
So you say that psychiatrists should have, if there is anyone, customer, client coming with depression or memory loss or anything, the first thing they should do is a SPECT scan on the brain.
Or another way to look at it. I mean, there are a lot of ways to look at the brain.
But why are you so favor of SPECT? What's the difference? What do you see?
Well, if you think of the major ways to look at the brain, there's something called quantitative EEG, looking at the electrical activity of the brain. We do that too. There's PET studies. It's also a nuclear medicine brain imaging study. There's SPECT. There's fMRI. I like SPECT because when we started, it was the cheapest. It was the most widely available. And it gives us this beautiful three-dimensional look at brain function. EEG really is an outside-in look. You're measuring electrical activity from your scalp. It's pretty weak, and you have to infer data a long ways away. Mm-hmm. SPECT is inside out look, where it's a nuclear medicine study. We inject a radiopharmaceutical. They're done millions of times every year, and it lights up the brain from the inside. And so I can look at deeper structures in your brain, like your cerebellum or the inside of your temporal lobes, the hippocampus, which is one of the areas. The hippocampus is sort of the star of memory rescue. It's involved in memory and mood, and it just gives us a better look at it. And now with 188,000 scans, it's sort of hard to change. Because, when I look at your scan, I have a pretty good idea what's going on.
Does COVID hit more people with ADHD and with other brain issues like that also? You said that.
I don't know. It's not been discriminating among the sort of mental health categories, but if your brain is already vulnerable, COVID is more likely to hit it harder. There's a term I coined many years ago called brain reserve. So brain reserve is the extra tissue you have to deal with whatever stress comes your way. And if you've been working on keeping your brain healthy, you have a lot of reserve. But if you've not, and then you get hit with something like COVID, you're more likely to be negatively impacted.
But what should these people, COVID survivors like myself, do now when I know that I've had this? I've read some researches that it hits the IQ also. I don't know that. So what are the inside the bright minds? What are the most important factors that we should address now. I have chosen ginkgo biloba and another thing called senescent cells. I'm trying to hit them. Am I remotely on the right track?
I think you look at all the risk factors. So ginkgo, I'm a huge fan of ginkgo. It increases blood flow. I think exercising is a great thing to do as well. Continue. You're in a job that requires new learning. I think that's really important to work your brain. You want to decrease inflammation. And that's one of the things I've really seen with COVID-19. It causes sort of a persistent inflammatory response. And so omega-3 fatty acids should just be part of all of our diets. You also want to make sure you floss, because gum disease increases inflammation as well. And probably taking a good probiotic and working on gut health is critical to decreasing inflammation. I also like curcumins from turmeric that decreases inflammation as well. I love saunas. Actually, a lot of the research comes from Europe because saunas help to detoxify the body, but they've also been shown to decrease inflammation and help with mood. I want you to have a vitamin D level that's not normal, but it's high normal. It's around 60 or 70. People tend to do better because that strengthens your immune system. And then making brain health and sleep a priority. Because when you sleep 7 hours a night, it turns on 700 health promoting genes. And when you don't sleep, it actually turns them off. And so sleep is a critical piece to recovery. And so memory rescue in many ways could be COVID-19 rescue, because this is what I've seen over the last 30 years of looking at the brain. If you want to keep it healthy or rescue it, you have to prevent or treat these 11 major risk factors.
We were touching nutraceuticals also right now, talking about curcuminoids and omega-3s. There's lots of fuss always around nutraceuticals. What would you say are the pros and cons of using them right now in 2021? What should we keep in our mind when choosing what to take?
Well, just right away, most doctors don't get trained in it, and so they dismiss it. And I did a debate at the American Psychiatric Association on SPEC, because my work has been considered controversial. But whenever we do a debate, we win. Because, I mean, what's really the argument against more information to help your patients? And I was debating the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Texas. And he's like, oh, there's just no research, like there's no research on supplements. And when it was my turn, I'm like, how did you get to be the chairman of a department? Do you read? There are 15,000 scientific studies on brain spec. So let's not say there's no science. You might want to read it. And oh, by the way, there's a large science with nutraceuticals and supplements. For example, St. John's Wort has 29 randomized placebo-controlled trials on 4,500 patients showing it's as effective as antidepressants, but with dramatically fewer side effects. And it's just the ignorance irritates me. And I have a book I wrote after Memory Rescue called The End of Mental Illness. There's a whole chapter on supplements. And there's 286 scientific references. So I get irritated when people talk and when they don't know. So the pros of supplements is they're often effective for the right thing. Like I'm a huge fan of saffron. Saffron has 24 randomized controlled trials showing it's as effective as antidepressants. Plus, most antidepressants sort of knock off your sexual life, and saffron enhances it. Saffron's also been found to be helpful for memory. So they often work. They're usually less expensive. They have dramatically fewer side effects. And they're available. And the negatives are sometimes they do have side effects, so you have to know about it. Most people's consultant for supplements is the teenage clerk at the health food store. So they may not get the best advice, and they're usually not covered by insurance, so they may be more expensive for you. But when I compare the pros versus the cons, I'm like, they should be considered. And in my mind, I'm always thinking for my patients, first do no harm, use the least toxic, most effective treatment. And it just seems like something people should consider.
May I ask, what is your daily routine regarding nutraceuticals?
So we actually make something called Bright Minds powder. It's a super brain-directed multiple vitamin with brain and memory power boost, which has always been our best-selling supplement. I think, single ingredients are not the way to go. The brain doesn't get sick in one way. There are many roads to trouble, so you want to get many roads to help. So I put that in a shake in the morning, along with something called Neurogreens. It's a powder made of vegetables and fruit and mushroom blend. I'm a big fan of smart mushrooms, so I put a mushroom product in my shake, along with some blueberries and protein powder. And then I take extra curcumins. I played football in high school, so my knees will bother me if I don't, along with omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin D, and a probiotic.
There are different omega-3 products available. Some have more EPA and some have more DHA. And DHA is said to be efficient more in the brain. Would you recommend to use a product which has more DHA in it?
No, actually. And that's a little bit of mythology. Okay. When we look at omega-3s for depression, it's EPA that works. DHA doesn't help. When we look for ADHD, EPA helps, not DHA. Memory and anxiety, DHA is helpful. And so I like a product that's about 60% EPA, 40% DHA, and that matters. And I don't know, in Europe, here in the United States, we get an omega-3 index. We actually look at the level of omega-3s compared to omega-6s in your body. And there are just so few people who are not supplementing that have healthy omega-3 levels.
But what is your, at this point in America, the average ratio between omega-6 and omega-3? I know that in Europe it's 25-1.
And that's the same as ours, where a healthy level is more like 4-1 or 3-1.
3-1, yes.
And it's our, once again, it's our terrible diets.
Yeah, it is. Very much of omega-6s and very few of omega-3s. It is, though. Yeah. So, and you're talking about American diet. I have to say that we are not in a much better condition at all. You lead the way and we follow all the time.
Yeah.
So
we export.
Yeah.
We're exporting illness and not happiness.
Yeah. You refer to very many researches in your books, and I have to applaud you for that. That is really, really important. Do you have a daily routine keeping you, so to say, posted? Do you go on daily basis to research basis and find out what's emerging, what's new?
I get an email, like 10 of them, from the National Library of Medicine every morning. on what's new for brain SPAC, what's new for various supplements, what's new for ADHD and Alzheimer's disease, just as a way to keep up. There's so many ways to get information that you have to be careful not to get flooded and spend too much of your time on your gadgets.
Dr. Raymond, where do you think the mankind is going? Where are we heading? What do the SPECT scans show you of our status quo?
Yeah, it's bad news. I'm not happy with the world that my grandchildren are going to occupy, with the manufactured foods, with social media that's driven by advertising dollars, which means it's going to be more negative because that's what the brain pays attention to. That the incidence of learning behavior problems in children has just skyrocketed. I'm concerned. On the other hand, I know things can change quickly if we get enough people. You know, one of my big goals in life is to end mental illness by creating a revolution in brain health. And people go, oh, well, that'll never happen. And I hate the term mental illness. It shames people, stigmatizes people. It's wrong. And I think it's probably worse in Europe than it is in the United States. I think we perhaps maybe talk more about it. But I want to get rid of the term mental illness, call these things what they really are, brain health issues, and create millions of brain warriors. You know, people who are serious about brain health. We're doing this influencer series on Instagram that's just been doing so well, where we take people who have big platforms, scan them, and then talk about it. Mm-hmm. And it's really been a lot of fun to sort of, it's like, let's stop talking about mental illness and let's start talking about brain health. Because nobody wants a mental illness, right? Call somebody mental. I don't know how that would be in your language, but if you call them mental here in the States, that shames them, mm-hmm. diminishes them. But if you call them a brain, that elevates them. That's sort of a cool thing. So if we can create brain warriors and really help people have better brains, we're going to decrease the incidence of, quote, mental illness.
How do you describe a brain warrior? Who is he, she?
She is someone who asks herself this question every day. Is this good for my brain or bad for it? Is this good for my children's brains or bad for it? My husband, my parents, is it good for my brain or bad for it? And if you can answer that question with information and love, and brain warriors are armed with good information, then you just start making better decisions. And with better decisions comes better relationships, comes more happiness, comes with more money, because it's about decision making, right? I mean, ultimately, the quality of our lives is based on the quality of the decisions that we've made over years.
And this is a revolution, I have to say, and I'm really glad that I can be a little part of your revolution now. With your book being now translated into Estonian language, a language that is spoken by approximately 1 million people only. And that is considered one of the most difficult languages in the world. By the way, I found this fact out today. Do you know how many languages is Memory Rescue translated into?
I think it's about a dozen languages. It's in Japan and Korea and China and France and Holland. I mean, I don't have the list in front of me, but the book is done really well.
So now you can add a very small language there also.
I love that. Thank you.
You're welcome. But you said that you are actually a children's psychiatrist or trained children's psychiatrist. What do you have to say about the digital addiction that we have nowadays? What does it do to their brains, and have you expected it?
I actually did. I did a fascinating case study of when parents would take a child's gadgets. He would become violent and broke furniture in his room. And so obviously we took the gadgets away. And then we scanned him while he played. And it disrupted his temporal lobe, one of the areas involved with violence. I'm very concerned about the gadgets and the developing brain. Our brains evolved over millions of years. And all of a sudden, since the 1980s, the brain is now evolving with constant stimulation, with blue light, with negative images. And that is not good for brain function. It is not good for the developing brain. And the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends we don't give kids gadgets and we keep them away from it as long as possible. The problem is many parents use it as babysitters, and it's just not in our best interest. But the technology companies are so rich and so powerful that it sort of doesn't matter. And we have to be more careful. So I think if I had a young child now, I'd really limit their exposures to gadgets. And when families are watching TV together, people often have 2-3 gadgets. They're watching television while they have their computer along with their phone. And it's like there's so much input. How do people get things done?
And this also disturbs our focus and our long-term ability to focus, I guess.
And our sleep. And, you know, there's an increased incidence in the diagnosis of ADD. Now, ADD is real, and left untreated, it can really hurt people. But it's increasing because we're increasing the stimulation that is required in order for anybody to pay attention.
Okay, we clearly have stated that we need to put our minds into the bright minds, whether regarding ourselves or our children. And I assume, maybe falsely, but I really assume that every single person wants to be healthy and at their best at all times. And motivation, I guess, at these times is more of a keyword rather than knowledge. We do have the knowledge, we just tend to lose the motivation sometimes. And especially when things get hard, when you have to do all the 11 factors, all the bright minds factors, how would you suggest we can maintain or reignite our motivation when we slip?
Well, everybody slips. And it's about maintaining focus. So I have an exercise called the one-page miracle. On one piece of paper, write down what you want. Relationships, work, money, physical, emotional, spiritual health. What do you want? And, you know, if I had to contribute my success, one of the things I would say is for 40 years, I've been very focused, but in a balanced way. That I focus on the health of my relationships, which is why Tan and I have a good relationship. I focus on what I want to accomplish at work, what I want for my health. And so I'm always asking myself the question, does it fit? See, it's not what somebody else wants for me, because that's not motivating. But what I want, that's motivating. And if I know I want to have energy, and I want to have a memory, and I want to be in the same size jeans I was when I was in high school, both because I'm vain and the other part because I want to be healthy, then my behavior tends to match. But very few people actually spend time planning their lives than they do planning a vacation. And it's this little question, does it fit? So if I know with Tana, I want a kind, caring, loving, supportive, passionate relationship, if I know that and I get a rude thought in my head, which happens all the time, I don't say it because it doesn't fit. And if I go out and, you know, it's my birthday and people, you know, they like want to give you a cake. And I'm like, why are we going to celebrate by making me sick? It's that doesn't make any sense to me. And so motivation comes from clarity of your goals. And I find so few people have them. When you ask them what they want, they talk about retirement or money or a promotion. And none of those things make you happy. It's having a balanced, connected, purposeful life that tends to make people happy.
Very beautiful thought and very correct. Dr. Raymond, our time is coming up and we have to wrap things up, but I would like to ask you one more thing. As stated before, besides writing and being a practicing doctor, you also own and run Amen clinics in US. Do Amen clinics and you personally treat only US citizens, or do you have patients, clients, customers from amongst people from all over the world?
We have patients from 150 countries.
Oh.
And so we, you know, my books are translated all over the world. And yeah, we see people, you know, the pandemic sort of put a crimp in that for a bit, but the world is going to open up hopefully soon. And we love our patients.
Do you think that we are going to open up soon?
Well, we'll see what happens after the Delta variant goes around. I'm hoping that with vaccinations and more thoughtful distancing. I never liked the term social distancing. It was a bad term. It should be physical distancing. And I sort of like Japan's practice of bowing rather than shaking hands. Ever since I took microbiology in medical school, I'm like, why are we shaking hands? I don't want your germs jumping on me. So I'm hoping by next year, things will begin to be more normal.
And with this hopeful sense, I think it's very good point where to end our conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Raymond, for that. And I have your next book, The Mental Illness, right beside my bed that I'm reading in the evenings. And hopefully one day we can have that in Estonian language too. So thank you very much for joining me today. I appreciate it very much.